using the laptop microphone, it wasn't picking the audio, so I lost the audio from last time, although I was recording. So so I'm recording this one. I did some test before we started, so I know the audio will be at least usable. Funny story. There's a time I ordered a microphone online, and then it got here, and I noticed that you need a mixer to use the microphone. But funny thing is, I went online and checked the price for a mixer, and just seeing the price for like a basic mixer, I decided to just pack the microphone and send it back because I was not going to pay that much for the mixer. So I don't know if all God grows, maybe we get some point where we can like afford such things. I think I'll get a mixer so that I can have like a professional setup. But yeah, um, if you know a trick of like just getting a basic, maybe USB. Oh yeah, for sure. But then I'm thinking of like opening. Maybe we can open like a GitHub sponsors thing, and then maybe we can contribute for stuff like that. I think as we grow, we'll be able to figure out our way around that. But if you guys know of a way to like get a mic that I could just maybe USB plug to the laptop, or a plug and play type microphone that I can use. I mean, it's so simple. It's just audio input. I mean, you could do that with the. Thanks, David. So David has updated the PR. Oh, so I was saying you could just do that with even earphones. So I'm not sure why microphones, especially the condenser ones, require such a complex setup to like put up. So yeah. But if you guys know of a microphone that I could just buy and plug in, I think it will be nice. You can recommend either on my Twitter, or hit me up, whichever way you can. Okay, so let me just pull David's latest changes. Okay, I won't do the setup. Let me just reuse what I had. And let me not forget this time to increase this font. 150. Okay, so I've pulled that change. Just confirm. Okay, new changes. Yeah, David, you need to write better commit messages. this, this is not it. You need to like really describe what you're doing. Yeah, even here you would have added some more detail. This was good, but yeah, you should have mentioned the utilities class. Always try to like have a descriptive commit message so that if things go wrong, you can be able to trace problems easily. If you guys noticed, I have like a commit template. So if I'm doing like a commit message, there's a commit template that I've created that I'm able to use. I think it's on my gist. Let me see if I can share that. Public gists. Predicate sharing. Where is it? I wish you could search these things. Public. I don't know how I named it, but there's a gist that I usually use to act like a template for the GitHub messages, and then I have a lot of this. A little bit difficult pulling it up, but anyway, there's a way you can like create a commit template and plug it into your local Git directory under Git messages. So when you do a commit, it's able to pick up. I think it's documented under the Git website, how to set up that git commit templates. Oh yeah, this is actually the original piece. I just created a fork of it. Yeah. Okay, I think I also forgot to fork it. Let me share the link. So what you do with this is you can have a template like this that describes how you want your commit messages to look like. I think if you work in some organizations, they'll actually give you this commit template. Maybe they'll have like a Jira ID or the issue ID, and then you describe what you did. First of all, the title of the commit of the changes, and then you describe it somewhere here, and then there's some instructions about like how many characters you can include. And then the way you plug it in is within your local Git, there is this directory. Under the root directory, you can create a file, Git messages, and Git message, and then you can add the commit template. So locally, I have it configured. So for instance, if I added a minor change like that, and maybe if I added it and decided to commit, I notice that template pops up. So you can edit it with Vim or whichever editor you want to use locally. But basically here I could add the description of the title of the change, like change to this. And if there's an issue ID, I could just do issue ID and maybe plug in the issue ID. Actually, you leave that space blank, but you can plug it in here. So you can add some more information. You could just plug in the issue ID or the Jira ID if your company is using Jira. And then, of course, when it gets on GitHub, this will be automatically identified. So I'll just roll that back. But if you guys get time, you can check that out. Git restore staged. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that should get us back to where we were. Okay, so this is the latest push that that David has done, and now we have the utilities directory. Okay. So like I said, I'm going to just do a few tests to make sure that that this code actually works locally before we merge it and then proceed. So I'll first of all try to compile it. So just in case you're wondering what Maven compile is, we're using the Maven build tool, and you usually get these commands that you can use for the build cycle. If you are new to Maven, I think I can share a resource for that. So Maven is a build tool just like Gradle that's done by Apache, and you can use it to basically compile, build, and ship your application. Yeah, so this is the official site. Information on some of the commands that I'm using, I think, should be available under the user guide. Should be a getting started tutorial here. Yeah, so this will talk about the setup process. Yeah, and you'll see the one we've used. How do I compile my application? So I'll explain some of those commands, how you run tests. I'll see that. In fact, let's do that locally. So you can just execute those tests. So now it's executing the tests. Okay, so David, you seem to have some failing tests, but we'll check those out later. Yeah, welcome, Rispa. Anyway, so there's so we have 29 tests. These are test errors. So 12 of them have errors. I think we'll check out what those are about. But basically, you're able to execute tests. You can run various stages at the same time. So like the execution stages are usually in phases, and there's like some order to it, some hierarchy to how you execute the processes. So the first one is compile, and then you get to test, and then the first one is clean, which like removes any existing cached build files or any generated classes. And then the second one is so the first one is clean. So this will remove any generated build files. So like if you look at our existing code here, there's this target directory. So this has generated classes and sources. So if you run clean, it basically removes this. So that's the first stage. So in fact, let's execute it and see. So once we do that, you'll notice that generated folder is removed. Okay, so the first one is clean. Then the second one is usually test. It's usually compile. So this one takes your code and tries to make sure that it's compilable. Then after compile, then there is test. So this, since you've compiled the code, so this will test out the code. And then there is the install one. So this one will create a deployable file, an executable file. So Java has two types of executable files. There is a jar file and a war file. Before I go any further, maybe let me just share the link to this resource. I see David is talking about I have application value property. We'll revisit this. Let me maybe explain a bit of Maven to somebody who is new to this, and then we'll go back to the failing tests. Yeah, but I can imagine why you would have this problem. Maybe it's ignored on your side, and now I don't have the same configuration, but we'll check it out. But anyway, I've shared the link to the Maven resource. So then, there's types of deployable files. So in Java, we have something called a Java jar file. And these jar files are they're like windows.exe files, and they're basically deployable files. So the documentation talks about jar files are packaged with the zip file format. So it's like a normal zip file. So you can use them for tasks such as lossless data compression, archiving, decompressing, and archive and packing. These tasks are among the common uses of jar file. You can realize many jar file benefits using only these basic features. So basically, this allows you to compress your whole Java application, and then when you put it in an executable environment, like on Windows, anywhere you have the JVM, you can just run that jar file, and it will execute your classes. I don't think it does obfuscation or data hiding for your code automatically. I think you need to like use an external tool for that, but basically it will take all your classes and put them into one package that you can deploy. Like I said, you can look at it like the windows.exe file that you can like put in any Windows environment, and then it will be able to execute, or the mac.dmg file that you can execute on Mac OS. So there's some more information here about how jar files work, how to create one. On Windows, if you're building like a UI, a GUI application, when you package it into a jar file, you can basically just double tap on it and it will execute, just like any desktop application that you have. So the other format is, so there's a lot of information here about Jar files. So if you guys get interested, I'll be linking those resources there so you guys can check it out a bit more. So then the other deployment format is WAR file, and this is mostly used for web applications. So the difference between the jar file and the WAR file, do you want to go to Wikipedia? I think there should be some official documentation for this. So the difference between a jar file and a WAR file is servlet container friendly. And what is a servlet container? A servlet container is in Java web applications use this concept called servlets, and servlets basically enable you to do basic HTTP processing easily. So they like provide an API on top of like running a simple HTTP server. Just like in your Node.js environment, you could just run like a Node.js HTTP server. So servlets help with that. And within the Java ecosystem, we have these deployment environments we call servlet containers. An example of them is Tomcat. There's Tomcat, I think there's JBoss. And basically it's an application that you can run on a server and you can deploy a WAR file. So you package your application into a WAR file and then basically it's actually a copy paste thing. So you can copy paste it in a particular directory in that servlet container, and then your WAR file it becomes available for receiving HTTP request connections or stuff like that. So WAR files are good with that. They allow you to package your application in a way that's easy to deploy. So this is some really old documentation, but I guess it documents a bit of that. SAN one identity server contains a number of web application archive files. Yeah, so that's the full name, web application archive files. And like I said, they are mostly used for deploying Java web applications. So these packages contain Java servlets and Java server pages. So Java server pages is a bit of a legacy technology. It's not very complex. Java server pages is just a template engine. The same way we have ThemeLeaf. I don't know for other web frameworks. I'm sure PHP has a template engine. I just can't remember the name. So most web frameworks have like a template engine that you can use. And template engines allow you to build simple front ends for your server side without having like a full-on JavaScript framework for presenting the front end. The most popular that I usually use is ThemeLeaf. ThemeLeaf is a bit more of a modern servlet engine. But back in the day, for most enterprise Java web applications, they used JSP. JSP looks a lot like PHP. The old way of like, if you ever wrote old school PHP without like a framework, so you have like tags, you have a PHP tag, and then within that PHP tag, you have scripts for maybe accessing the database and querying data, and that lives within your HTML file. So that's basically how JSP worked. So that reference, so there's some explanation about what WAR files are here, but just think of them as a deployment mechanism for Java web applications. I don't know if this document is well updated to share, but it has some basically good information here, so you can check it out. But if you look at the Jakarta project, I think we can find a better explanation for things like servlets, servlet API. If you guys were on last time, I think I talked about the Jakarta project, and the main thing you need to remember about the Jakarta project is they generate these specification documents, and what those specification documents basically do is they describe how some core components of building Java web applications should work. So when you're doing persistence, I think we looked at JPA, Java Persistence API, and I compared it to OpenGL. So OpenGL is a specification. It's not like an API that you can call. But that specification is implemented by Intel, is implemented by maybe which other company manufactures, most companies that manufacture graphics card, like Intel, ARM, and the other companies. So they implement that OpenGL specification. So the same way within Java ecosystem, we have Jakarta that generates the specification documents. And one of the specification documents is JPA that we looked at last time. And you'll find that JPA is implemented by Hibernate and Red Hat and some of those companies to like do ORM. So in the same way, we have the servlet API specification that's like defined by Jakarta. So here it is. I hope it's not like last time where we opened and found that the document was empty. And they always do updates for this servlet API specs. Let's look at 6.0. Yeah, so yeah, you'll find there's some documentation here. So clarifying and decoding normalization of URI paths, updating cookie classes, related classes, get real path. I think this mostly it's handling how you process URLs for your web application. Get remote address, so you guys can imagine what that does, character encoding. So it's mostly web stuff. And I think you can dig into most of this, but there should be like a final specification document that you can like download and read and maybe understand how whichever sublet container like Tomcat or JBoss, like I mentioned earlier, you can see how they go ahead to implement some of these aspects. Yeah, so there's a lot of information on these specification documents that you can always find, like handling sessions, session timeouts, dispatching requests. Basically, you can get like a really serious understanding of how Java web applications work. And each of the sections will go into a lot of details into explaining to you how exactly your framework handles this. So if you're working with Spring, you'll be able to understand exactly how Spring handles some of this. So for instance, this section on filtering, that's very important in doing security. So basically the way security is done for Java web applications, you have like filters that are built into your web app, and when requests come in, there's an authorization filter that checks whether the user is authenticated, authentication filter that checks whether the user is authenticated, authorization filter that checks whether they can access the resource, multiple filters to like check a few things and enable you to like build in security. So I would encourage you guys to also kind of look at this specification. There's a lot of them under this Jakarta project, and they basically document everything that you'd end up doing for Java web application. Yeah. Okay, so before I fall into the trap of explaining that Java serverless, I think Java serverless deserves to have its own section where we just dig into it. But let me roll back to where I was. So I was explaining Maven, and we got into the install phase, and I was telling you this allows you to generate the deployable file. Apart from this, there is the package phase that I don't normally use, but I think that package phase works together with install to generate that deployable file. So the cool thing is you can actually run all these phases in one step, and the trick is you don't need to mention every step you're running, although there is a syntax for doing that. If you look at the spec, the usage guide, you'll notice there is this example where they're doing Maven test dash compile. Yeah, so this allows you to compile the existing code and execute the test at the same time. But there's a shortcut you could just go ahead and do. If you do Maven test, like so. So if you went ahead and did Maven test, so that would execute clean, compile, and then test. So it executes everything that comes before that particular phase. So if I went ahead and did Maven install, so that would do clean, compile, test, install. If I wanted to make sure that clean was executed, I could do Maven clean install. And that would do is execute the clean phase, execute the compile phase, test phase, and then finally the install phase. And that's the same thing that happens if you do package. So if you did Maven package, so that would execute clean, compile, test, install, and then finally package. So maybe let's see a bit of this in action. So we did Maven clean, and you notice it removed the target folder that has generated classes. So if we did Maven, I think we've done Maven test, and you'll notice that executes the test. If you did Maven install, it will do the test and then try to do the install phase. One thing I need to mention is within this Maven phases, if your code fails in any of those phases, so for instance, if you are doing Maven install and your tests don't execute, then it terminates execution. So you won't have a deployable file if your tests are failing, which is like a safety mechanism. So if you're doing this, most people do this on a CI, like Circle CI or something configured on your GitHub Actions, so that if you do like a commit, you guys know how CI tools work. And this Maven commands will be executed. If you did a commit and that commit is breaking some of the tests, the deployable file won't be generated, which means the deployable file generally won't be deployed. So it ensures that your code remains safe. You can always, these shortcuts, so if you wanted to like deploy with failing tests, you can actually do that. There's a command where you can do Maven clean install, and then you can pass in the same way you like pass in command line arguments. So you can do dash skip tests, and that will make the code skip tests. So you notice we have failing tests, but we have that deployable that has been generated. So if you look at this line, installing Rick and Morty snapshot WAR file, so it has generated a WAR file. So you might be asking, how did it know to generate a WAR file and not a jar file? So you do that in configurations. So under this POM file, you'll notice at the top here we have packaging. So this specifies what type of packaging we want to use. So if you wanted to deploy a jar file, you just change that to jar, and if you execute the same command, you notice now we have a jar file, and all of that is placed inside this target directory, which contains generated classes and files. But of course, if we did it the right way and just if we did it the right way and just executed Maven install, it will try to execute the tests first, so it won't skip the tests. And if the tests fail, of course, you don't get the deployment file. And just to reiterate, if you did Maven clean, then the generated files disappear. Let me just return this war so that we can run it for other things. Okay, so I guess I've explained that exhaustively. So I encourage you to look at the Maven document that explains some of those phases in depth, and talks more about how to like do configurations, and you can do plugins for some interesting things like test coverage. Maybe you want to get a test coverage report after you execute. You can do that within some of the Maven within the Maven configuration file. Cool thing with Maven, it only has one configuration file, so it's not like other build tools where you have like maybe 3. I know Gradle maintains 2, if not 3 configuration files that you have to like take care of. But with Maven, you just maintain the pom.xml file and you're good. CMake has the CMake list file, so you just maintain that CMake list.txt file, and your project works well. So it's also a very simple project management build tool. Okay, so let's get back to the project. So we have some failing tests. What I'll do is I hope David is still in the call. I'll allow you, David, to like explain, take us through why some of the tests could be failing. But I'll also like to change how I'm executing it so that we get like a nice report. Just go to this test directory, and this time I'll execute with the IDE. So by the way, you don't have to like do those commands. You can just use the IDE, but I'd encourage you to like know the commands. So the IDE has, so you have, okay, all the other tests are passing, but there's a failing test in the character management class, and the failure message is error creating bin with name show character controller defined in show character controller class. This is a common error when you're doing Spring, and so it's complaining about the show character controller. Yeah, so it's complaining about I'm not seeing a mock or an auto wire for the controller. So anyway, let me hear from David first. I would propose a fix, but let me hear what his thought was while doing this. So David, if you are still with us, I've enabled you so you can.
Thanks. I was telling you, there is a place in that test we are supposed to inject the property value of domain coming from the application file. So I set it in the application file as a URL. So you have to go to your application properties file and set it there, the value of the domain. If you can see the variable domain anywhere. It's supposed to come from the value of, go to the utility class.
Utilities.
That domain, see the...
Oh yeah, this one, eh?
Okay, where you are calling that method, that get next URL.
Okay. So within the service, there we are calling it in a few places.
So check where the domain is coming from.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. So you need to create that value property.
Okay.
In your application property file.
Okay, so within the
you can call it anything. I don't have any specific name.
Okay. I think maybe I can just use the same name, api.domain. api.domain. Maybe I can call it www.oldguard.com. Would that work? Would this work, David?
Yeah, it's supposed to work now.
Okay. I don't know. I feel like it won't, but let me see. Because I usually have this application.properties file, but then I have a test application.properties file. But let's see. Maybe it will pick up that one. Let me just execute it. Oh, okay. It picked up the production one, but usually I have a test application.properties file.
I think I should start doing that.
Yeah, in case you want to have custom configuration. So what I'm referring to is I usually do I wish I could just do a resource directory. Oh, there we go. So under tests, you have like a resource directory, the way your production code has a resource directory, and then under resource directory you create application.properties. Should I add this to Git? No. And within application.properties, then you'll have that config. So that allows you to plug in your test configuration. What I'm curious about is what if we delete the production code one and see whether we'll be able to work with that. The one available under tests. And if everything goes well, yeah, so it should be able to read that. So you don't necessarily need to write on the production code one. And the reason why people do this is the application.properties file usually holds sensitive information. I'll enable you in a bit, David. Let me just disable this to be safe. After we got attacked last time, I'm a bit more careful. So there's one why we usually have that application.properties file, and I appreciate why, David, your code doesn't have the configurations for that. Is usually have sensitive configuration like your SMTP. If you're doing email delivery, you have the SMTP server username and password, and application.properties, maybe you have the database username and password and the URL for where the database is. So you don't want to check that into version control. You don't want that to be floating somewhere in GitHub. So somebody could pick it up and attack your actual physical servers. So the way people go around this is those application.property file configuration components are plugged in when the app is deployed on the server side, on the server environment. I'm curious to see how other guys approach it, but the way I usually do it is I have a bash script that's running on the actual server, and when the CI sends in new code, that bash script has there's an application.properties file present on the physical server, not in the development environment. And when the development server is compiling and building this code so it can push it to the deployment environment, like maybe a servlet container. I like using servlet containers. The bash script plugs in the application.properties into the code before it's deployed. So that way, I can push the code to GitHub without the application.properties file, but then when it gets to the physical server, the server is able to put the SMTP server credentials, the database URL, and all these other sensitive configuration things that I don't want to be in the production environment. I'm guessing most people will do this under the CI. And if the CI is running through GitHub Actions on the GitHub environment, then I guess there's still a bit of risk that's present there. So I prefer to lock it in on the physical server. But it will be fun to like hear how you guys go about it. So if you ever have like this setup, you can comment there on the chat and tell us how you go about it. But it's usually very risky to have those configs floating around on your GitHub. Okay, so I think that solves it. Thanks, David. So that solves the issue we had. So the problem was David has configurations under his development environment that are not present on ours, and he didn't check those into VC into version control or into Git, which is actually best practice. You don't check in your configurations into version control. So I'm curious here. So one of the ways you can navigate this. So for instance, if you want to deploy the application locally, and for you to deploy it, you have to plug in those configs. The way you normally deploy it on your local environment is you can create the application.properties file for your local application.properties. So you can create that application.properties file, but then what you do, you don't add it to a Git. And then under your git ignore, I don't know if you had a git ignore for this. Oh yeah, we have a git ignore. So under your git ignore, you can go ahead and ignore that file. So that's under, hope I get this right. I think I can just do anything dot properties. So if I do a git status, okay, so it's still being seen. I think I can do dash resources dash application.properties. Yeah, so you'll notice previously it was being tracked by Git, but now it's not being tracked. So I can go ahead and do add in like some sensitive information like the server, maybe data source, or like the one that David has, like the API.domain one. So I can go in and add that API.domain and maybe put in the actual domain, which could be, I think I can use a string, regard.com. But this won't, if I do a git status, that won't be seen in VCS. So I shouldn't be able to have that in my file, in the code that's available on GitHub. So I can safely set up the database connection URL. I can set up all this SMTP server locally, everything that I need, but it won't be checked into Git, which keeps those configurations safe. Okay, so it's good now. I think the first check, all the tests are working. So I think we can go ahead. Let me look at whether we still have that formatting issue. We don't, but David, you seem to use a lot of white space. Our settings, you are late today. But thanks for joining anyway. So you seem to have a lot of white space. I don't know if this is intentional or these are just places where you forgot. I noticed it in some other areas, but I think right now you've added some formatting, but you still end up with a lot of white space. It's a styling thing. I think we can do like a style guide configuration for the project, So the IDE can like pick it up automatically, but right now it's not very critical. I think we can go ahead and plug it in. So before I merge this code, let's just go through what David was able to add, and then maybe I can ask him a few questions about some of the components, and also for us we can probably dig into some of those APIs and the programming constructs that he added to the project. So I'll go through it layer by layer. So we'll start with persistence, see whether there's anything that he added in persistence. Then we'll go to service layer. Then we'll go to the controller level. So I'll just go to, maybe let's see what we have before the code is merged. So if I go to the root project, yeah, so this is what we had last time. So we had done one entity, this show character entity, and these were the properties that it had. Let me see if David added another entity. So under entities, it's still the same entity, so there's no change there. And then so you usually move from entities represent the database tables, then you go to repositories, which has the database queries, and then we'll go to the service layer. So let's go to repositories. So the repositories, we have this one character repository that seeks to query this, handle this show character table. And we had one function there, find by name. I think we plugged this in for demo purposes to like show how to add custom methods. And what basically that does is it obtains the entity by name. We talked about this syntax a bit, where you prefix find by or delete by, and the Spring framework is able to identify the postfix, and if it matches a database column, like if you look at show character, I wonder why that section disappears. Yeah, so if you look at show character, we have this name attribute. So when you do find by name, then Spring Boot is able to detect it. But all this is documented, and I think there's a lot more detail that's provided. Let me just pull the docs for it. So under Spring Data JPA, actually there's a way to automate this process. Anyway, I'll just be coming back to admit guys. So under Spring Data JPA, there's a section here on handling repositories. Reference doc. JPA. Defining repository interfaces. Yeah, so under this guide, you'll find some documentation of how you define those methods. There's some introductory concepts here, but let's see if there's a better way to navigate it. So I'm doing this in full screen. Sometimes it hides the menus. So defining query methods, I think that's the section. Yeah, so query creation. The query builder mechanism built into the Spring Data repository infrastructure is useful for building constraining queries over entities of the repository. So this shows a bit of examples, so like find by email address and last name. So these query methods seek to emulate the normal SQL queries, where you probably do select all from user, where email is equals to this, email address equals to this, and use that keyword, last name equals to that. So you're able to have that representation of that whole SQL queries by just customizing the query methods. You can use things like distinct, which is borrowed directly from SQL, order by, limit, yeah, even ignoring case and some of that stuff. So I think that's documented under property expressions. But basically this document explains to you like how you can define the query methods so that Spring Data JPA is able to do the underlying SQL query for you behind the scenes, so you don't have to like write it all on your own. But if you get to a point where you want to like write the actual SQL query, like I mentioned last time, there's query annotation. And let me hope it's documented here. Not stored procedures. There's at query annotation. I can't tell exactly where it's documented here, but basically you can use an at query annotation. Like on this one, you would probably do something like just go to the repository. So if you wanted to run any of these queries on your own, you could just plug in at query. At query, and then you pass in the value, and the value in this case would be the SQL query that you want. So you could do something like select all from show character. Where name equals that, and the name would represent the query argument that you have there. So I'm sure there's some documentation on how this works. Let me see if I can pull it up. Maybe it might have more info on like how this works. But if you just Google Spring Data JPA, you'll be able to find this doc. But just like everything, let me just plug it in. Okay, so let's look at those query methods. Spring Data JPA at query. At query annotation. Yeah, should be documented somewhere here. Oh, yeah, okay. Query lookup strategies. Oh yeah, there it is. So using at query. So using named queries to declare queries for entities is a valid approach and works fine for a small number of queries, as the queries themselves are tied to the Java method that runs them. So some of those arguments become the function arguments of like your actual Java code. You can actually bind them directly by using the Spring Data JPA query annotation rather than annotating them to the domain class. So this frees the domain class from persistent specific information and collocates the query to the repository interface. There's an alternative annotation, named query, that gives you some additional capability that you'll not get with the query annotation. I think if you want to like do advanced queries, that maybe you have like join queries and stuff like that, you'll be able to achieve that better with this. So basically, this is similar to the example that I showed. You'll see how we are finding by email address, and you are not with that query, and then you pass in the actual SQL query. Select you from username, you, where u.email address is equals to that. This index represents the index of the argument in your function. So like in this case where we only have one argument, so you'd have that there. But if you wanted to do a select by name and maybe by age, if that was available in our table, integer, then you could do something like and age equals query argument 2. So that will reference the second query argument. Okay, so you guys can check it out. It's available on the same doc, and I'm sure they've also documented the named query approach. But before you get there, I think you can try and lean on the available syntax that I showed earlier, where you can just do find by, then the name of the column you want to query. If you want to do an and or, you just do or and then the name of the second column that you want to query, and then it will produce the actual SQL query behind the scenes. I think I was able to show that last time. Even if you execute the code, you'll be able to see the actual SQL queries being executed. Let me just undo this. manually remove that. Okay. So back to the code. Okay, so let's see if David added additional query arguments. So under character repository, we had this. So that's what we had last time. So David was able to add find all by status, passing in the status, and pageable. I will discuss what that means. Find by name containing ignore case, containing ignore case. So yeah, we are finding by name, and of course still pageable. And the other method that David added was find by name containing ignore case and status containing ignore case. And then the last one exists by name, which, just from the name, I think self-explanatory. So I would be curious to maybe get David's explanation of how these functions work and why he added them, and then maybe we can do a bit more of an additional deep dive. So I don't know if David is still on the call. So David, if you're still there, can you walk us through some of these functions and what they're able to do for the API?
Okay. So I got the inspiration to do this first of all from the original Wicked Multi API. I looked at what the filtering they were doing, what they were looking for. Actually, it was just one endpoint, which was for character. So that character was finding all the characters by the filtering either by name. That's why I did the third method, the one that is filed by name containing no keys. So it's supposed to get all the characters with that name, and also when you are providing the name parameter, it should not be case sensitive. That's why I said I talked about the string name. Pageable is about pagination because they were saying in the documentation it's supposed to every page should contain 20 characters. So that's what that is for. The fourth method is supposed to check to filter by name and the status. So you're finding out the characters that will match the name and the character and the status. Then the second one was supposed to find all by status. So there was a filter for that. Then there was a Boolean for existing by name. This was supposed to check for a character if it exists. So for my case, I was thinking that every character should have a unique name. So I can check so that when I'm saving a new character, I don't have to save a character that already had been saved before by the same name. So that was my thought process and why I included those methods.
Brilliant. I think that is a very good explanation. And I like the way you relate it to how the final API works and how these repository functions contribute. Of course, as we go through the layers, we'll be able to maybe take a detour back and kind of see how the repository is serving the service layer and the actual API endpoints. But thank you so much for that explanation. So I think that I can delve into a bit of, apart from the query syntax, which I've talked about a bit and shared the documentation that you guys can check it out a bit more. The other new thing here is pagination, and pagination is not a new. It's not a. I hope it's not a completely new concept for you guys. But what pagination allows us to do is, in my mind, I think it helps to create high performance APIs. And the way you do high performance is either you can return data quickly or you can batch the data that you return to the client. So you don't, I think the explanation I used on our last session, you don't, if maybe it's a bank system and somebody is requesting all their transactions, they want to review their transaction history, you don't give them all the 1 million records they've had over the past maybe 5 years. Instead, you start with the recent 10, 20 or 50 records and you return that, so that you don't clog your API with the extensive queries. So pagination actually enables you to do that. So you can, the client can, in some cases the client can tell you, like, I want 5 of the most recent transactions, and you as the backend or the API will be able to, using the pageable API or using pagination, you're able to query the database for the most recent 20 records. so you'll be able to return that promptly. So within Java, we have the pageable API. The pageable API, I think pageable could be under the JPS spec as well, but Spring Data JPA has its own implementation of pageable. And what pageable does, it gives you the capability, one, to be able to customize your database queries so that you basically develop the limit. There's that limit syntax in SQL that allows you to limit the number of items that are being returned. So you can customize limit, and of course if you have a sorting order. Two important things while doing pagination is sorting and paging. So if you want to return 5 records and you have 1 million records, you have to have a priority for the records you will choose. So like in the bank example I talked about, find the 5 most recent. You'll see this with the M-Pesa app. If you install the M-Pesa app on a new device and you're trying to look through your old transactions, you'll find maybe there's 2 or 3 transactions there. So they don't give you everything all at once. But then when you start searching and trying to tell them, I want transactions from last month, or I want transactions that went to KPLC, you'll notice that the transactions start appearing. And what that does is, one, you get a sorting order. The sorting order could be date. Sort first by date, most recent to oldest, and then now the page. From this most recent to oldest, how many do I want? So then it will just pick maybe the first 5 or the first 10 from the already sorted values. So the Spring Data JPA APIs will give you the capability to do those 2 things. You can define the page and you can define the sorting order. And I think I've explained why the sorting order and the page. The sorting order is important before you get to the paging part. And so you don't return 5 records from 5 years ago when somebody maybe just wanted to see whether the purchase they made recently was actually as they might predict. So maybe you can look at docs as it's our tradition. So those APIs, you notice there's page and there's pageable. So page is more like optional. And the optional API in Java, like we've discussed, allows you to avoid the null pointer exemption trap. So if there is no record in the database, the API does not return null. Instead, it returns an empty object. An empty object is not similar to a null object. An empty object can be queried, it can be analyzed, it can be checked for values, basically. So you avoid your program from failing when there's no data. The documentation, Java doc there talks about it's a container object which may or may not contain a null value. If a value is present, you can call is present to check for that, returns true. If no value is present, the object is considered empty, and is present returns false. So instead of doing if value is equals to null, you can just call is present, which is a bit more expressive. Additional methods that depend on the presence or absence of a contained value are provided, such as or else. So or else allows you to pass in a closure. So you can say if present or else. So if present, execute this, or else do that other thing. So if there's no value, you can have some code run. If there's a value, have some code run, some different code executed. Of course, it goes ahead to talk about those things, but what you need to remember is that at least you have these utility functions to check whether there's a value. So saying this is similar to this in that the same way optional tells the API that after it does its select query on the database and it doesn't find a value, it should wrap it in an empty object, or if it finds a value, it should wrap that value into an optional object so that you can extract it. The page attribute allows you to wrap the result of that SQL query into a page object. So the difference between returning a list and a page is that the page will have more information. One of the most important things that the page will have is if you are querying, if you've already defined your page, so maybe you've already sorted the records and you've said, give me the first 5, this object can actually tell you that there's 10 more pages of 5 records remaining. So you can do 10 more subsequent requests and get the values that you need. So let me just dig through the documentation a bit so that maybe you can get a better description of what the API is able to do for you. So if I'm not able to get the Java doc, if Java doc is not descriptive enough, I think I'll try and get something else. But basically, you'll see the technology we're talking about. A page is a sublist of a list of objects. It allows gain information about the position of it in the containing entirely.